Hi, my name's Jason Barcham. I'm an associate partner with Servian, New Zealand. Welcome to the Technology Whisperers, a technology and innovation podcast brought to you by Servian with your hosts Alistair Ross and Sean Muller. Join us as we demystify the latest emerging innovative technologies for businesses of all shapes and sizes, sharing our thoughts on how you can improve your current technologies, practices and processes to transform your business.
Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, wherever you are in the world. This is the Technology Whisperers, episode 12. I do thank you for joining us today with the hosts, me, Alistair Ross, and co-host here,
Sean G. Muller.
So thank you very much for listening in wherever you are, again, here on the Technology Whisperers. Today, we've got a fantastic podcast, which Sean has spent quite some time curating. And it talks about a number of topics that we've talked about in the past, previous podcasts in Technology Whisperers, really brings a lot of that together. So we're talking about cloud today, but we've also talked about technical debt, haven't we, Sean?
Yes, we have. I do want to, before we get kicked totally into this session, I do want to apologize for our listeners that listen regularly. The month of June got away from Alistair and I, and we did not have a episode on July 1st. But if you're listening to this now, Alistair and I are doing everything we can to try and fit these podcasts into our busy schedules, so we make sure we can bring this information to you that we think is valuable. This particular episode, we're gonna focus on something. Alistair is exactly right, that we touched on both in the technical debt, but also in the security podcast. We're going to be talking about migrating to the cloud. Now, whether that's cloud migration or transforming to the cloud or some mix of those different things, that's what we're going to be talking about today. Is we're going to go down a level and try and demystify a little bit of the approaches, the different types within those approaches, the 7 different options that we have for types of migration. We're going to talk a little bit about the reality is that no one size fits all. It really is a hybrid model. There are going to be some approaches and some migration types that work for some aspects of your business, and some that have to be done differently for other aspects. And really what that means from a becoming cloud native for how we go into the cloud and decoupling some of the layers of this. We're going to try and touch on kind of the consumption of data. So we have some ways that we consumed data in the past for our applications, and we have some more modern ways of consuming data and how that impacts that cloud migration. And then we'll talk a little bit about cloud architecture, and where we're really going to dive into cloud architecture is not actually the architecture. So I'm not trying to scare anybody off, but there are options and choices, and there are decisions that need to be made as part of a cloud migration strategy. And some of those have to do with making choices about the architecture. And we'll be touching on security and operations and doing things like leveraging existing services within the cloud, and when to choose to do that and when not to choose that. And then the last is we're gonna touch very lightly on cloud marketplaces, because I really think this is probably in the last 2 years has become a really important characteristic of clouds, is that now on the cloud you can actually buy services from other vendors that have deployed services onto the cloud pre-built for you, and it can accelerate a lot of cloud migration strategies. Does that sound like a good plan of attack, Alistair?
Yeah, so certainly a lot to get into there. I would say obviously to our listeners, we're doing this in the usual vein of our approach, which is demystifying and debunking all of the, I guess, the marketing mumbo jumbo, buzzwords, and breaking them down, but it's just boiling them down into something that makes sense to us normal human beings. And so throughout this, you've probably heard podcasts or watched videos or read training materials or whatever on the topics that we're covering here today, and that's quite possible. But I think hopefully what you'll get from today's session is that it's cohesive enough to bring all of that there into one place, and hopefully gives you this a really clear level of understanding. So if you've got bits and pieces through, other podcasts or other videos or whatever in the past, but yet the terminology might still be a bit abstract for you, then hopefully what we talk about today can bring all that together for you.
Yeah, it'll put it together. And we're going to touch on this. We're going to try and help with the language that if you're a technical person and you're working in an IT department that's beginning that cloud transformation, the language that you use to talk to the business and the executives. But this is also aimed at a lot of the business and executives, so you have a better understanding of, and we'll try and highlight that. That's part of the demystifying that we bring to this is that if the technology teams are coming to you and saying something to you, you need to have at least an understanding enough. And sometimes the myths in the technology and terminology get overblown. And so we're going to try and touch on that. So I think that kind of leads in that first topic, which is types of cloud migration, or how we get onto the cloud. And Alistair, I want to start with the first one, which is, I would probably say over the last 10 years is probably 80 to 90% of cloud migrations, and that's lift and shift.
Yep.
Why don't you give us a breakdown of what lift and shift really means?
Yeah, it's a good place to start. And, I think this one sometimes, depending on who you speak to, but usually the sort of seasoned cloud experts out there, this sends a shiver down their spines. But look, I think there is that case, that's, or the cloud snobs out there. But the reality is that you have to get started somewhere. And having your technical debt or whatever you want to call it, the situation where you have all of this technology, which is probably sitting anywhere between a co-location data center that you might be a server in your back room with a guy with sandals and a beard longer than yours, Sean, but it could be anything.
I don't have sandals on today. I don't.
No sandals, just the beard.
No.
Yeah,
that's right.
But it could be all of these sorts of situations where you have your data in different places. Could be on the cloud as well. Don't forget that. We're in 2022 now, and your applications, you might have software as a service applications. You could have things like Salesforce, for example, that classic example there of SaaS. So you've got a whole mishmash probably of data, applications, and infrastructure just sitting somewhere or probably in multiple places. So when we're going to the cloud, we have to consider our methodology of migrating to the cloud and how do you do that. And so this lift and shift is probably the first one that people take on because it's the easiest to conceptualize. It's basically saying, here is what we have right now in its virtual machine form. Probably a lot of most organizations moved on from server hardware like direct tin physical hardware, whatever you want to call it, and opted for virtualization at least in the last sort of 10 to 15 years ago. So we've got platforms
the ones not running Solaris.
So we've got VMware, we've got Zen, we've got, I guess, a few other
Hyper-V.
Hyper-V, of course.
Yeah.
So we've got all of those sort of platforms out there. And the big cloud operators all have a migration methodology to actually migrate those VMs into basically just VMs in the cloud as well. So you're basically lifting and shifting. And that's where that terminology comes from. That makes sense?
And let's add a couple of terms. So on the business side, oftentimes what you hear or what gets said to the technology teams is, give me like for like. Or can't we just keep doing what we're doing, but put it on cloud infrastructure instead of our infrastructure? Oftentimes what we hear from a project perspective is, oh, no, we're just going to infrastructure as a service. We're not going to do the cloud thing. We're just going to go to infrastructure as a service. And one of the things I want to highlight here is that lift and shift and then transforming once you're in the cloud is not automatically the wrong strategy. But it can't be your only strategy. Oftentimes organizations that say, we're not going to do anything, we're not going to assess any of our kit, we're not going to look at our existing applications. What we're going to do is we're going to lift and shift and oftentimes the second statement is because this is going to save us money. And here we come to one of these demything things. Lifting and shifting to the cloud is not going to save you money. Even from a total cost of ownership, it's not going to save you money. Now, it will make processes better. You will get security patching, infrastructure patching will happen right away, but you're going to pay for that on a monthly charge that is going to be about equivalent to what it is for you to either lease your own hardware or even to buy your own hardware every 5 years.
Mm. Yeah, and it's important to add to that point as well that if you are just moving, if you're just lifting and shifting and not transforming, you're not doing anything other than taking a VM from your current data center, sticking it into the cloud, so AWS, Azure, or GCP, Google Cloud Platform. If you're moving it to one of those three and you're just simply leaving it as is, then you're not going to reap the benefits of cloud optimization. And we'll come on to that in a moment. But just quickly speaking, those sorts of things that you briefly touched on there, Sean, like automated patching, I mean, there will be some level of automation. But when we're talking about your VM, what you've got on your own VM, if you're just doing like for like, all of the patching of the operating system, for example, that's not going to be touched. That's not going to be done. So you're still going to have all of the overhead that your organization has to this date for doing that level of maintenance. So, I mean, if you've got like Microsoft come out with Patch Tuesday, for example, right? And in your organization, you've probably got an IT department or an IT security department which deals with Patch Tuesday and ideally will update servers, Windows servers, with a patch if it deems it necessary to roll that out. Now, what is possible with the cloud is to take the power of the cloud and the managed services of the cloud to have some of these things done for you so that you don't have to pay or deal with your engineers' time, your IT staff's time to do those things when the low-hanging fruit, the easy patches and stuff like that could really be done for you, or at least with minimum effort. So so just be aware that when you're doing this lift and shift and nothing else, almost all of those benefits of the cloud, the optimizations you get, will not be applicable.
Now remember, and to highlight what Alistair and I are saying is that if a consultant comes into you and tells you you cannot do lift and shift of anything you have into the cloud, then they're not necessarily taking the best approach. You need to do an analysis work to identify which things it makes sense to do a lift and shift into the cloud and which things it makes sense to transform or redevelop. And so that kind of leads into our second migration type, which is transforming and then migrating to the cloud or as part of the transformation migrating to the cloud. If a consultant comes in and begins talking to you about this, they're going to say things like, we're going to make your applications cloud ready, or we're going to make your data sets or databases cloud ready, or your business processes cloud ready. The language they're using is they're talking about a multi-year project to get your applications and business processes ready to go onto the cloud. Now, that might be perfect for your business. That might be the direction you want to go for your business. But if you're not aware that that's what you're getting into, if you're at a point where the contract for your data center is about to run out, a transformation and move to the cloud is not a good approach because it does have this long tail. And the long tail is often the people that use the existing applications don't want to get off them. And I have been in several projects, and Alistair, I know you have as well, where we've literally transformed an entire application, redeveloped an entire application to be cloud ready. And there's one person, sometimes the CFO, sometimes the GM of IT, is still using the old application. And because they're important enough in the business and they don't want to use the new one, you can't move that application because all of the data lives within a tightly coupled monolithic solution that isn't designed to run and take advantage of the cloud. So understand that it can be a mix of these things, and part of being ready to go to the cloud, you're going to hear terms of like, well, you need to have a cloud center of excellence. You need to have, an entire cloud architecture team. You need to have cloud consultants come in and help you do these things. Depends on the landscape that you have and how complicated and interrelated all those systems are. If you have a large monolithic application that 99% of your business processes run on, then yes, it's probably a good idea to look at a cloud center of excellence or bring some cloud consultants in, because you're going to have to peel those business processes out of that monolithic application, because you can't take a monolithic system and transform it to the cloud. It's going to have to be decoupled, and the systems are going to have to be pulled a little bit apart. The last migration type, and this one is less so a migration type than a true transformation type, and that's redeveloping those applications specifically to build them onto the cloud. Oftentimes what we see with this is that we've migrated the data to the cloud, but we're still using these larger, tightly coupled applications, oftentimes on-prem or in a hosted data center. Now we need to redevelop those applications to be cloud native, to take advantage of the cloud services, to Alistair's point, to the patching services that the cloud offers, the security services and operation services that the cloud offers, and even the availability numbers, to truly take advantage of the availability numbers. And then this is my favorite one. And so that the applications turn off when they're not being used.
Yeah, it's a very good one. Yeah.
Yeah. So what we see is applications that are developed to run your data center. Once you've bought the hardware, you've paid for it, and you want all of those applications to be available 24/7, even if nobody's using them. And you've already paid for the hardware, you've already paid for the software development. Just run them maxed out the whole time. Once you move to the cloud, you're paying for what you use. So
Consumption-based model.
that's right. So if you on Black Friday, if you want your application to scale up to be able to handle 10,000 customers coming in, but that at 2:00 in the afternoon on Christmas Eve, you know that you're not going to have 5 customers coming online. You want to be able to scale. You don't want to build it for Black Friday. You want it to scale down to the minimum so that when a customer comes on board, you can respond to them, but built so that the system responds and spins up more instances of itself so it can handle Black Friday. And so it spins down and costs you less money. That's cloud native. It's taking advantage of the cloud services to be able to provide you, when you need it, the processing power and memory and storage to do the things that your business needs to do.
Yep, absolutely. So all in all, you may have heard of the terminologies of the transformation to cloud, so the approaches. So it depends on which organization you listen to, whether it's Microsoft for Azure, whether you listen to Google for the Google Cloud platform, or whether you listen to Amazon for AWS. They all are relatively similar. But the ones that, I guess I'm familiar with the most is AWS's ones, just probably because they've been around a lot longer. They started off, I think, as like 5 or 6, and now there are 7. So I'll just rattle them off, shall I, Sean? Just so we familiarize the listener with what those are, and
we've talked about them before. We
Yes.
talked about them in the tech debt, and we'll go a little bit deeper into them today. But Alistair, why don't you give them to us?
Sure. Okay, so the 7 are rehost, replatform, refactor or re-architect, repurchase, retire, and finally retain. So let's just start at the top of that list, shall we? And we can skip right quickly through the first one, which is rehost, because effectively we've already talked about it. It's lifting and shifting, right?
Yeah, it's lifting and shifting.
Now, I think the thing that we probably didn't mention is that some lifting and shifting is easier than others. So when it's x86 virtualized architecture stuff and it's running in VMware, say, that sort of stuff is really easy. Like there are migration wizards these days that will just lift up your VMDK files, your VM machines effectively, and then import them into the cloud. That stuff really easy.
VMware even has services if you're running actual VMware on premise or in your hosted. VMware actually has services where, as a service, they will migrate your VM into the cloud of your choice. And in fact, I know on Azure and AWS, I don't know that I need to check on GCP, but there's a VMware service that you can get running on their compute. So it's almost seamless. The application just, it stands up, notifies, tears down, DNS updates, and you're running in the cloud.
Yep. Yeah, really, really easy. So it's, if you just wanted to go like for like and literally just run your VMware VMs in AWS and Azure, you can actually do that. But
let's talk about those caveats. So
yeah, so the caveats effectively are the ones which are bare metal. So even x86 equipment, which is literally hosted on the machine itself, so you're not running a VM, it's just the bare metal, that sort of stuff, that can be a bit more tricky because you have to somehow abstract that what's running, the applications themselves that are running on the VM, sorry, the host itself, and then migrate them over. So it's a little bit finicky. Oftentimes that often involves actually just standing up a new VM in the cloud, say a new EC2 instance in AWS, and then sort of doing a copy of the data and the applications over. So sometimes things break in that migration. So it's not a true lift and shift. It's a lift, shift, and a bit of a tinker a bit. But the real hard ones, I think, come when it's sort of non-x86 native stuff. Yeah. So we're talking about the IBM Power architecture here. We're talking about the Spark architecture, non-classic architecture stuff, the stuff from mainframe and big machines like that. So your mileage will always vary. And so that probably, when you're talking about a lift and shift, the ones which are not classic x86, it's possible that those will not fall into the lift and shift category.
Now we do need to highlight there, and so Alistair and I talk a lot about Google and AWS and Microsoft because they are the big three players in this, but we do need to highlight that there are managed services and there are smaller clouds like IBM SoftLayer, which is now cloud managed services, that can do these non-standard hosted AIX, or they don't do Spark, but they do so that you need to Alistair's point, your mileage may change based on where you go, but understand that there are options for you out there as a lift and shift process.
Yeah, so for example, if you're running IBM Power architecture on an AIX Unix environment, that's really going to be
it's hard. Yeah.
It's a tough migration into the cloud. So what do you do, right? You've got two main options, really. Do you decide to refactor your applications, so basically create new applications or make significant changes into whatever they are and then put them in the cloud? Or do you buy into a new cloud which supports, like Sean said, the IBM data center? They'll have hosted AIX on Power, so you could just lift and shift. Well, that's the easy option, but it's also potentially the longer term, more expensive option, or it will hold you into a life cycle of further technical debt. There's pros and cons for both. I'm not saying that, and again, going back to what we said in our technical debt episode, technical debt isn't always the wrong thing. It's a dirty word or a dirty phrase, but it's not always the wrong thing to do. And neither is lift and shift, right? Okay,
that's right.
So just want to make that clear. All right, so I think I'll close out lift and shift, or rehost as AWS call it, by saying that it is worthy of note that applications are easier to optimize or re-architect once they're already running in the cloud. There are methodologies and wizards and things like that you can do, and you can say, hey, I've moved this from VMware, now it's in an EC2 instance, for example, in AWS, and now all I need to do is plug this here and there, and it will migrate that into more of a cloud native application. So
and sometimes you can solve some of your technical debt, like patching operating systems, consolidating licensing. So there are technical debt problems that you can solve with rehosting, but again, there are challenges with it, because oftentimes what you find is the reason you haven't patched is because an application can't live with the patch, and you may find that you can't run the operating system. Like if I have been in an organization where one of their servers was running Windows 95. Now, anybody that knows anything about IT will know that Windows 95 is not a server operating system. They had to run it on a special instance of VMware to be able to run it. And when they tried to rehost it onto an EC2 instance in AWS, the whole thing fell over because the drivers weren't supported in the operating system. The operating system fell over. So there are, it oftentimes from a business perspective, you're like, yeah, this is just too complicated. Just rehost everything in the cloud, and understand that sometimes it's difficult.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on to the next one. And this is a kind of, I guess, a middle ground from the
Yeah.
rehosting one. So this is called replatform. So this is where you make a few cloud optimizations. You don't go whole hog cloud native, but you make a few optimizations to achieve a tangible benefit. But the core architecture of the application does not change. Now, I'll give you an example of this, and one that I always go back to because it's easily relatable. Sorry, that's a bad pun, which is to reduce the amount of time spent managing database instances by migrating to a database as a service platform. So again, I'm not picking on Amazon. I like all three big cloud providers, but like, let's just say Amazon's relational database service, RDS, is a drop-in replacement for the most common database types, so or Postgres, SQL Server, all that. So they're basically what they're doing, Amazon are doing under the hood, is that they're running an instance of Oracle or SQL Server or whatever for you, right?
Yeah.
But it's a black box.
Managed.
It's completely managed. You don't need to worry
Patched.
about that. Patched. It's highly
has
available.
Security. Yeah, highly available, has operational monitoring, and even provides you SLAs out of the box.
Yeah. Now, what you'll see is if you hosted your own EC2 or virtual machine in the cloud and installed SQL Server, say, on it, versus the cost of running RDS with SQL Server, you will see that the cost of running RDS is higher than running that EC2. And so if you just took that at face value, what you're thinking there is, hey, why would I ever buy this RDS, which is more expensive than running my own SQL Server? But that's where the whole point of the cloud comes into its own, and you're missing the point of cloud if you don't get that distinction. What you're paying the money for is for Amazon or Google or whatever to look after that instance for you and to do all that heavy lifting. So basically that could be a full-time person's job, indexing those databases, patching those databases, doing all of that good stuff. You're basically just taking that whole time away and really focusing it on just having a reliable database. So it's a really good...
And this is, there's an important point here, right? And so there's a bunch of additional cloud services that you get that you don't have from one that you manage yourself. And we're going to touch on that a little bit when we get to cloud architecture. But if you take advantage of those services, things like, read replicas and being able to scale the data instance out without having to re-architect how your database is consumed. So out of the box, just by enabling these identity access management services over the top of your database and how the database works, there are things that you get out of the box. All you have to do is enable those services for the database. And by the way, it works for hosted platforms as a service, whether you're running Microsoft Windows as a service in Azure, or you're looking at a managed Linux instance. The same exact thing becomes true is that you get additional services that are part of the reason that you're paying additional money.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you. So the next one is refactor or re-architect. And this one really talks to how you could reimagine how the application is architected and developed using cloud native features. This is really going into that cloud native aspect of things. So yeah, taking a step back from what you've got right now and redefine what you've got and say, hey, is this suitable for a consumption model which suits the cloud? And like you said, Sean, obviously it's a scale up, scale down on consumption paid model. So things vary just in terms of architecture, just to suit that in and of itself. So when you're re-architecting, it's driven by a strong business need to add features, scale, or performance that would otherwise be difficult to achieve in the application's existing environment. So, you've got a monolithic application, that one won't scale in the same way as a cloud native application. If you think about containers and how orchestrated containers, applications that run inside containers, that lends itself very well into a cloud native environment. So if you have a monolithic application, that won't scale. That sits there and it needs compute and it will just consume and consume and consume. Whereas you can have containers that spun up and spun down on demand as per your application or your clients require, your customers. So if they're going to a website, you're serving up a website, for example, and it's an e-commerce website or something like that, it could be running, when it's idle on 1 or 2 containers. And then,
That's right.
when you
That's
get
right.
to the point where, you've got 5,000 customers, it could require 25 or 30 containers or something like that, and it could just scale automatically. That might need some refactoring.
Well, and so one of the examples I like to use is that if we look back to some of the applications that, Alistair, I know you and I both had to deal with in the early noughties and in the 90s, where there were actual SQL calls to SQL databases. So we had a web interface, oftentimes it was used internally within the company. And in that web interface, we had to fill out, a blank, or we had to, we clicked on a button and it showed us a table. And those were actual raw SQL queries directly to the backend SQL database. And if it was not done correctly, which is cross-site scripting attacks set aside, if it was not done correctly, that web application could actually lock up the database in the back so that nobody else could access it or do anything.
Yeah.
Or worse than that, 2 people accessing the same application trying to update the same field within the database would fall everything apart. There are still today organizations that are using applications that are architected this way, and decoupling those so that the front end uses, decoupled API architecture to be able to update those databases on the backend side means that the databases can scale and can flex differently without impacting the front end, and the front end can spin up additional instances the way Alistair was describing and be able to serve your customers more fluidly.
Yeah, so it's clear to see the advantages of this model, and that is, I would generally say, as a trend. It's, when you've all heard of DevOps, you've all heard of that. This is the way that the industry, generally speaking, is going. However, it is not to say that it's not the only method, and it is probably one of the more expensive ways. So when you're doing it right, and it's quite complicated and it is quite expensive. So bear in mind that you will spend more money than your classic monolithic. Here's a database server, here's a web server, and here's an application server. Boom, boom, boom. That's it, done. It's not going to be as cheap as doing that.
And
okay?
I'm going to put my enterprise architect hat on for a second there, Alistair. I'm actually have
taking
the
fedora off and putting this big egghead hat on.
Yeah. So from a business perspective, one of the things you need to look at is that what applications bring you the best business value? Where are the applications that you have, where are you getting the most value from? And that if they transformed and you could do them better, you would get the most value for the business. And those are the ones that make sense to do cloud native transformation. If you have your internal workforce management tool, is this, massively tightly coupled with your phone system and your call management system and everything else, and it's going to be massively expensive for you to move to a cloud native solution for that might not be a good fit if you don't do much call center or workforce management. So, when you begin doing the assessment of lift and shift, replatform, refactor, or repurchase, which is what we're going to talk about in a second, that's one of the questions. How much business value can I get out if I do this? And does that make it worth it? Indeed. So let's talk repurchase.
Repurchase, yes. So basically, going again to a classic model of software licensing, I think is probably where I would start with this. So perpetual licensing, or at least annual or biannual licensing, is the classic approach to licensing software, right? When we're dealing with enterprise software. So enterprise software can be everything from like the applications you run on your desktop all the way through to stuff that sits in the back end, like ESBs, the enterprise service buses,
Oracle database,
Oracle, that whole sort of stuff. So let's just think about it as the stuff that sits on servers for this perspective. And so basically, again, having perpetual or annual licensing like that really doesn't fit well with a cloud consumption model, an on-demand style model. So think about having an analysis piece of work on what you're about to shift into the cloud, and look at the type of applications that they are, and whether the license that you have on them right now sits well with the target approach. So it's probably more likely that you're looking at for a software as a service type model license, which is that changing it probably from an OPEX cost into a CAPEX cost into an OPEX cost. So I'll take an example where you're moving a customer relationship management system, a classic CRM, say you're moving that to something like Salesforce.com. Everybody's got an idea of what Salesforce.com is. It's a web page. You go to it and you just pay a monthly bill for the consumption of that, or an HR system like Workday to a content management system or something like that. That sort of stuff.
Yeah, no, this is exactly right. And where we see this really playing out is in the procurement side. So you're going to do, as we move to the cloud, you're going to have negotiation around licenses. Oftentimes you can have a discussion with your vendor and say, hey, we're moving to the cloud. And they have a different license structure for the cloud. SaaS is a perfect example. So with SaaS via 4, they're actually coming out with cloud consumption licensing. Or if you're moving to Oracle and you're moving your Oracle database and you want to move into the cloud, you may have to restructure the way that you do licensing to optimize it for use on the cloud. And so those are going to have to be taken into account in the projects and how you do this. And by the way, I have seen a scenario where licensing wise and perpetual licensing, the way Alistair's talking about it, it made better sense to go lift and shift of something into the cloud for licensing purposes because the licensing was so good than it was to begin consuming the same exact service as a service from the vendor.
That's right. So if you got a perpetual license, say, that you bought way back when, and it's still giving you enough benefit in the current day, right, that you're not having to update that piece of software or whatever it might be, or you're still licensed for the latest version of the software with that perpetual license agreement, whatever it is, you have to put all of these factors into consideration, right? So that's a great point, Sean. Like if you're moving you might want to just put in a lift and shift rather than go cloud native, even though when you look at it on paper, it makes sense to go cloud native with this application because it would give you X, Y, and Z benefits, and yet it would be cheaper. But then if you actually look at the cost of the licensing right at the end of the whole thing, you go, hold on a minute. But if I do it this way, cloud native, it's going to cost this plus this plus this plus this plus this. But we're already paying like this on the licensing cost. That's less, even with lift and shift into the cloud. So that's a very good point, and certainly something that can be overlooked or can be forgotten about until the very last minute. So definitely worth thinking about there. Right. Okay. So we'll quickly move on to the last two now. These won't take very long. Yeah. Retire and retain is the last two. So retire is basically the pretty much what it says on the tin. So if you think about it, retiring applications that are no longer needed. Sometimes when people get caught up into migrations into the cloud, it's like a big, we must migrate all the things to the cloud. And sometimes it's actually better to take a step back and say, hey, should we just switch this off? Do we actually need this? Is there these two people in the back room that use this one application? Can we not just shift them onto something else? Or do they actually have to use this? So spending the necessary Q&A time to go around the organization saying, hey, who's actually using this? And if you don't get any responses back, eventually you can go to that point where you just switch it off. And if still nobody complains, then that's the case where you probably don't need to migrate it.
And that's actually a really good point. I'm seeing a lot of enterprises that are now starting to get to the point where they're like, the data hasn't changed in this application. We can't see anybody accessing it. We're going to turn it off and see if anybody raises a ticket. So there are some organizations out there that are part of their project plan is, we believe this thing should be retired. We're going to turn it off and see if anybody complains. If somebody complains, then we'll take a look at fixing it or helping them get off of it. And in the meantime, what we'll do is we'll archive it so that if, there's a caveat to this. There are certain business processes and applications that only run once a quarter or even once a year.
Yeah.
If the application is not documented, my suggestion would be is that if you don't have operational logs that go back far enough, to see if somebody's been accessing the system, that you might want to run for 3 months through quarter end before you decide that no, because I have seen some applications that literally were only used once a quarter.
Yeah, definitely. And then the final one is retain. And again, that's pretty self-explanatory. It's basically to keep the applications that are critical for the business, but that require that major refactoring before they can be migrated. So basically, you're not going to do any migration in this round of migrations. You're just basically going to say, hey, that application, I'm going to revisit that later. And maybe at that point in time, it's more critical to migrate. But right now, we'll leave it in the data center or whatever it is. We'll just leave it alone.
Well, and there are some, there are some applications in some businesses, like I can think the power grid management system or the ambulance and police and fire notification systems that may never be migrated to the cloud because their service level agreements, their requirements for availability and uptime are going to be so great that to do it in the cloud would be too expensive to ever justify moving it to the cloud. So understand that retain is always on the table. It just needs to be validated, and you need to be making the decision for the right reasons.
Exactly. Yeah. Well said. All right. So that finishes off the 7 migration transformation into the cloud approach options, Sean. What are we going to talk about next?
Well, so we need to go into this. I want to dive a little bit into this idea that you're not ever going to do one of those 7 transformations for your entire IT. The reality is that what you're going to have is a hybrid. You're going to on a application by application, server by server. And by the way, I know a time when we had application servers, Novell application servers. That's how far back that goes.
You're showing your age now.
Oh my God. Where you would have several applications installed on a single Novell server. There are still organizations that do that. They install multiple applications that have nothing to do with each other onto the same server. Now, because we've virtualized, we can put them in their own virtual operating system, but there are still, even within some organizations, where they put multiple applications into a single virtual machine. The migration to cloud might be the time to separate those applications onto their own dedicated virtual machine, into their own dedicated container, potentially putting them in different data centers or regions for availability purposes. So the reality is that most of these cloud migration transformations are going to be hybrid. It's going to be a mix of all 7 of the approaches. And you really need to be looking at it with this idea of a front end view, a back end view, which includes the data processes, the business processes, and then a data view. And so each one of those are going to be kind of viewed and approached slightly differently. A front end application is something that either your customers or your employees use to regularly access back end business processes to do things. And the requirements for it are going to be significantly different than the back end application services. And the data services, what you're going to find is data is becoming the new gold within businesses. The value of data is now becoming massively important. And that means that applications that you've never had accessing your data are now going to need to have access to that data. And so whereas before with a data warehouse, we could say we could archive stuff off, and when somebody needs, I've actually been in a data center where if somebody needed something, this big tape machine with this robotic arm would come and grab the tape you needed and would load the tape into the machine and would pull the data that you needed off of it. But the reality is that nowadays, with that data being that new gold, from a data analytics perspective, you may need to have that data available all the time in a way that has never been needed before. So looking at those front end, back end, and how the business processes in the organization work will help to inform which of those 7 migration options works best for that thing. And if you get to a point where you're like, well, we've got this front end application that has a back end application and has data, and they have to be loaded onto the same server because that's the only way they'll work. That right there needs to be a red flag that you have a tightly coupled application that it needs to be assessed for transforming for cloud native, because what it means is that if you're scaling a front end application for thousands of customers, and that application, the server has to be sized to run a SQL server on it. I know, Alistair, you've seen that where the front end application had a SQL server running on the application.
Absolutely. Many times.
That could get massively expensive very, very quickly.
And it can also get very unreliable very quickly. And in fact, I would dare say the amount of organizations that have these tightly coupled applications already running, I bet the statistics aren't good about reliability. I'd probably just have to ask, clients to say, hey, have you got any of these older applications? And they're running SQL Server plus the front end plus, the data warehouse kind of stuff. What are they all tightly coupled? And if the answer is yes, and the next question is, how reliable is that? And the answer is almost always not very. It crashes a lot, or it's slow, or it's something's unreliable.
I remember back in the day, we had to do all kinds of weird things with load balancers and stickiness and stuff to make these applications appear more available than they really were in some kind, but it was always massively expensive. And so those applications become, if they're very valuable to the business, those are good candidates to look at transforming into cloud native.
Yeah, there was a lot of smoke and mirrors back in the day, wasn't there? And I say back in the day, but the reality is that I don't even think that back in the day was that long ago. Really, it's only taken until the advent of the rich advent of containerization or microservice architecture that we've actually seen a transformation to highly decoupled applications, which are much more reliable.
Well, and we're still seeing very, very many enterprises still running very tightly coupled applications. I mean, the banking system is a perfect example. The number of back-end systems that are still running in very tightly coupled manners for banking are huge. So, which gets us into this next topic, which I think is kind of important, and that's how these applications consume and utilize data, because the reality is that all these applications have some kind of data needs. Even if you're just talking about a website with a CMS, the CMS has a database, there's data associated with it, you have to do it. And how those applications consume data. If we go back to the late 90s and early 2000s, I'm going to say this, and then I'm going to caveat it with the fact that it's still happening today. If we look at the banking systems, or the stock investment trading systems, because there were so many people doing it at such a high frequency, they would basically record everything that happened, move their entire system to their disaster recovery system, and at night run batch processing of all of that data that happened during the day. So for these very high volume transactional databases, we're looking at this batch processing, which could be daily, could be weekly. I have actually seen a monthly batch process for something. And so a lot of legacy applications that are either tightly coupled or that are very, very high transaction tend to consume data and batch processing, which, by the way, is very cheap on cloud, but doesn't provide a whole lot of additional business value on cloud. And so we're starting to see requirements to go near real time or even real time on cloud for data consumption. And that oftentimes means that we have to refactor or re-architect the applications.
It does, yeah. I mean, a lot of batch queues, for whatever reason, when the logic was programmed back in whenever the application was coded, it might be a new application, might be an old application, but whenever, there are always set parameters around the batch. So, for example, an application programmer might have said, okay, well, the batch size can only have 100,000 entities, and then for some reason there's an anomaly. So if it's a bank, somehow there's some regulation thing that made an update on every account or something like that. So then that 100,000 all of a sudden for this one-off occasion has just turned into
it failed
5 million. It's failed. And so when, especially things like nightly batches, and you come in the morning and your night batch has failed, then you're a race against the clock to remedy that batch. And then you're also looking at, compute costs in as opposed to nighttime and all of that sort of stuff. So batch processing had even since its inception, we're going back to the 60s and the 50s here, right? That batch processing has been around for a very long time. Batch processing has always been fraught with known issues. It's not a trouble-free solution. It is probably an easy concept to grasp, but it's also, not necessarily the easiest. So easiest to work with. There are problems in that area. So things like this event streaming, which I think you're going to call and talk about, is kind of the next phase. So yeah, what is event streaming for the listener?
Well, so when we're talking about event streaming, so let's draw a little bit of a picture. The way that most applications up until about 5 years were developed is that you did something on an application and it wrote to a database, and then some other business process or application read from that database and did something with it. With event streaming, when you do something with an application, that data associated with it, whether it be a field you filled out, whether it be an action that you took, is streamed directly to the other business application that needs to do something with it. Now, some of the people that listen to us might say, "Well, email doesn't write to a database." Well, you're right, but an email goes to an email server where the email is stored and then it's forwarded on as a business process application. An event stream is, I type in it's closer to what an SMS or a text message is. I put the text message in my phone and say go, and it just automatically goes to the receiver of that directly in, like WhatsApp or Kik or something like that. Event streaming is the same way. We get applications that we have data that we're feeding into, and we know we have to do business processing with them. And we may send that data to a database eventually, but we're also sending it to something that can consume it on the fly and utilize that event as it goes forward. It allows us to not be dependent on locking a database. We can do micro batch processing. So we can event stream, and every 5 minutes we run a little tiny batch process where we write it to a data warehouse so that we can get data analytics from it. Data analytics we're not going to be consuming on a moment by moment basis, but the application processing of an ERP system, we might need to do that. And that's really the direction that we're starting to see a data consumption going.
Yeah. So there you go. That's our 4 main models of data consumption, and obviously that's kind of going from oldest to newest in a way. So batch being the oldest, then near real time and real time are kind of, I guess, on par.
Close. Yeah.
And then we've got event streaming, which is our most modern.
And let's, similar to the other things that Alistair and I say, there are times and reasons why you might still do batch processing. Asynchronous writes to, or log shipping writes to a redundant database in another region on cloud may be done in a batch process manner. And that might make sense. If your recovery time or your recovery point for a data set is only once a day, like you could lose 24 hours worth of data and it's no big deal, you might once a day write changes to your database to a backup database in another region, so that if the current region falls over, you still have all that data. So there are still valid cloud native reasons to use batch processing, but it's using it where it makes best sense and where you get the most value out of it.
Absolutely. Yeah, great point. Okay, so the final sort of topics that we're going to talk about here really is cloud architecture and cloud native. And then the final one is on just a brief talk about cloud marketplaces. So, yeah. Sean, when we're talking about cloud architectures and cloud native, what is that? What does it really mean to be cloud native? And I think we have covered this on previous podcasts, but maybe just a quick summary for the listener, just to say what is cloud native, because that's bounded a lot.
It does get bounded around a lot, and I don't want to scare anybody off by this part of the talk and fast forward. We're not going to dive into architecture. What I'm referring to here, and when we start talking about cloud architecture and cloud native, is really so that we understand the terminology of what we're trying to get. And what we're trying to get is that cloud native means it utilizes cloud services and cloud capability to provide the best value for your business. And that means we reduce the cost when necessary. We take advantage of the services that enhance recoverability, that we take advantage of the service level agreements that are built into it, that we use the functions and features properly. So if we have a database that regionally is automatically backed up to other regions, that we utilize that. I've gone in and done a cloud audit of a business before, and they had paid for the service, but they hadn't ticked the box in the service to say replicate to another region. And they had 3 outages where they had lost the region, and they didn't have a backup of the database because they hadn't ticked that box. Being cloud native means taking advantage of those services and functions. And we're going to talk on cloud marketplace here in a second, but it means that includes leveraging third-party offerings. So third-party configurations, third-party builds that can be purchased through the marketplace and consumed as a service or as a consumption-based pricing structure so that you optimize for your business. Because the reality is, if you're a dairy owner, if you're a convenience store owner and you're closed at night, you shouldn't be paying for your IT services to be running in the cloud at night. All of your services should shut themselves down, and they should turn themselves on 5 minutes before you come into the office. And by the way, every single cloud vendor out there has that for free. They have services for free that will turn your stuff off and turn your stuff back on. And if you utilize them, that's what being cloud native is about. So I really want to highlight this. It's leveraging these cloud services, whether they be security services, operational services. Alistair, talk a little bit about the security offerings that most of the cloud vendors offer that people don't take advantage of.
Oh goodness, where to start? I mean, there is a massive amount of security services now provided by all of the cloud vendors, and I think probably the reason that they're not always adopted is because of a number of things. One being that, say, you started your journey into cloud 5 years ago, and over that last 5 years, so many new services have actually been incorporated and put into either a free tier or a very low cost tier. But it's not, unless you stay current with the platform, you're not necessarily going to be aware of them. So there's the lack of awareness for starters. Secondly, it's the lack of time, I guess. Like sometimes it's a bit difficult. And then thirdly, obviously, it's complexity to actually incorporate these services into some. So if you've got some sort of not legacy application, I don't want to really use that term, but an application that is a bit finicky, that needs some sort of hand holding. So when you switch on things like even simple things like firewall rules, and all of a sudden the whole application just falls at its feet, that's the sort of stuff where you might be a bit scared, I guess, of implementing these new security technologies. But really, from all the way up, right? So there's things like, your classic sort of firewall services, and we can come on to that and again in the marketplace in a moment. But there are also things like guardrails, for example, which are a set of policies that basically say, here's best practice around security for all sorts of things, whether it's the accounts that you log into your cloud account with, locking them down so the appropriate people have access to them, using two-factor authentication, using, IAM and all that sort of stuff, all the way through. So there's so many different ways.
What about audits, automatic audits of systems to show you where you need
like CloudTrail
patching
stuff and so forth?
Yeah.
And then of course there's the more sort of layer 7 type services such as WAFs, so web application firewalls. The basic WAF service is actually built in, and up until fairly recently, I can't recall exactly how recently, that was switched off by default. So it's a free built-in service which protects web applications, and it's pretty innocuous. It doesn't really interrupt too many web services that I've seen. So if it's running over port 80 and 443 and it's not using WebSockets, there's a good chance that the WAF's just going to take care of a good majority of the standard types of attacks coming against your web application.
Well, and I think
why wouldn't
on AWS, on AWS, I believe the DOS service is, if you have a WAF, the DOS service is automatically free, but it is turned off by.
That's right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think it's switched on now, or maybe I'm wrong.
Okay.
But it's as a recent thing, so I might be getting confused with the different cloud vendors. I'd have to look it up. But
and understand that some of them, like Microsoft Security Essentials now, is taking streams from other cloud vendors. So if you have a multi-cloud environment where you have some stuff deployed on AWS or some stuff deployed in GCP, and you're, let's say you're using the security platform inside Microsoft, you can begin consolidating some of that security stuff into your Microsoft. There are similar services from the marketplace that we'll talk about in marketplace in a second, but there's similar services that you could have deployed on AWS and consume security services from the other vendors as well. And all of these things add and enhance cloud native in a way that allows you to take advantage of what you're. So remember how Alistair and I were talking about it's more expensive? It's more expensive because these services are there. So the fact that a WAF, just sits in front of your web application, your client-facing web application, if you had to build that and run that on your own premise, that would be in a cost for you. That's where that cost difference comes from, these enhancements and services that sit on top of everything. And if you turn them off, or you don't realize that they're there and don't turn them on, then you're leaving all of that value for your business in being cloud native.
Yeah. So there's actually a whole bunch of things like control tower and so forth that you can look through, which show you best practice. So if you're not familiar with all of these things, you can actually go into there and they will give you advice on what you haven't switched on, for example, and say, hey, if you switch this on, this is the implication of switching it on, but this is also what it does for you. And, there's just a massive big swathe of really, really good tools on all of the cloud platforms out there to secure your network. So yeah, if you haven't familiarized yourself with what those are, even if you're not a security expert or work in a security field, I think it's definitely worthwhile being aware of it, especially in this day and age. If you have anything to do with applications at all, delivering applications, developing applications, operational aspects of applications, security, all of that sort of stuff, any sort of involvement in the application lifecycle, I think you owe it to yourself to be aware of the security of an application. And the best way you can do that is, if it's in the cloud, look at the things like the best practice guides that they have, because they've got some really good guides out there and white papers and so forth.
And so from a cloud native development perspective, the security features is only one arm of it. The operational features, the disaster recovery, business continuity plan features that are inherently built into cloud services, oftentimes these are turned off by default. And so understanding what they are and turning them on and taking advantage of them, taking advantage of automatic replication to other regions. I remember it was a couple years back, there was an outage on the East Coast of the United States for AWS. An entire region went down, and every application that was deployed in that region became unavailable. And Netflix, even in that region, wasn't impacted. Netflix from the beginning has built their service on this idea that they could sustain a failure anywhere in their AWS deployment and their services would still be available. And so they've gone in and figured out which services and what applications and which out of the box things they can get from AWS, and they take advantage of those because it's part of the service that you're getting. And that's one of the inherent parts of cloud native. So it's not just cost effectiveness so that we spin stuff down and spin stuff back up when we need it, but it's also taking advantage of those services that exist there on the cloud, as opposed to either having to manually build something yourself. Which brings us to that last little topic.
Oh, sorry, I thought of something there just before we move on to that. Just as a point of reference, if you are looking for, like I mentioned, white papers and so forth, AWS and Microsoft do something very similar, but AWS do the well-architected framework, and it's a sort of interactive thing that you can go into. It's a guide, and you can tick the boxes one by one as a sort of checklist as you've gone along. So it's based on 6 pillars, and kind of like you were saying, Sean, security is just one part of it. Well, it is. That's one pillar of the 6. So in total, those 6 pillars are operation. I've just Googled it to remind myself of what they were. They were operational excellence pillar, the security pillar, the reliability pillar, performance efficiency, cost optimization, and sustainability. So if you think about all of those 6 things, really, those are the benefits that you get from going to the cloud, right? And that well-architected framework will educate you to be able to switch on those things that, by default aren't switched on. So
Yeah,
anyway, I
and
just thought that would be a helpful tidbit.
GCP has it. Microsoft. What I'll do is in the podcast notes, just if you're listening, I'll go ahead and put links to the three of them, one from each cloud. But Alistair's absolutely right. By the way, that's a good. If you don't have a cloud center of excellence or you don't have cloud architects on staff, that's a good starting place for you in your cloud journey. Now, you might be fully in the cloud already. Using those guides might help you transform what you have in the cloud to optimize it, because a lot of organizations are now having serious discussions about moving back into hosted data centers or even on-prem, because the costs of their cloud consumption was greater than what they planned for. And those pillars will help you really take advantage of the services that are on the cloud.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Sorry, I digress. Let's move on to marketplace, and we can
Yeah,
finish
so
up on
let's
that
touch
point.
on marketplace for a second. So every single one of the cloud vendors now have a cloud marketplace. It's worth, if you're a subscriber to a cloud service, going and taking a look at the marketplace, because oftentimes applications you are running, the vendor has built a borderline managed where they patch it, they maintain it, they keep it up and running marketplace offering that you can subscribe to and pay on a monthly basis. And you can move all of your configurations over to and begin consuming and running it. Firewall is a perfect example. If you're currently using Fortinet firewalls, you can deploy Fortinet firewalls directly from the marketplace. And I believe the last time I checked, which was over 5 years ago, so this may have changed, so don't hold me to it, but Fortinet actually allowed you to bring your licenses over from your on-premise firewalls into the cloud deployed marketplace firewalls. So these marketplaces, there are literally thousands of offerings. They're not just, on the Microsoft marketplace, it's not just Microsoft offerings. There are third-party vendors that have built SaaS offerings that are pre-built deployable services and applications that you can deploy into your virtual private data center that's inside Microsoft, yes, into projects in GCP. And oftentimes they can accelerate your transformation on the cloud.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's definitely worth a look into the marketplaces. There is also, it's kind of like it's analogous, I guess, to like the App Store on your phone, right? You can go in there and there's a massive swathe of applications and services that you can purchase and consume on a short-term basis, on a long-term basis, whatever you like. It's all a consumption-based model. It's also fair to say that there is a community marketplace out there. So these are still available. They're not necessarily free. Some of them are on a free tier, but it's a community-run marketplace on the official marketplace. Not that I have any major horror stories from these community instances. It's just to make you aware of the fact that, I guess, again, when I'm putting my security hat on, there are people out there, and it does make it fairly clear, at least on AWS, which ones are community versus which ones are, fully vetted by AWS all the way down. But it's important to point out that these community ones are not commercially backed. And obviously
Not
they could
supported.
have. They're not necessarily supported. They don't have a necessarily long software life cycle on them or support life cycle. They might even be, I wouldn't go as far as saying dodgy, but there could be stuff in them that you're not aware of. So just exercise caution, I guess, is
Absolutely.
what's the best advice on those.
I think it's from an architectural perspective, with your organization. I think if you had a list of the applications that you're using, going and looking at the marketplace and seeing if you could consume those from that vendor as a service is something that's worth doing, because oftentimes that can accelerate your transformation.
Indeed.
So we've covered, Alistair, we've covered a lot of really good topics in this
Lots
episode.
of stuff.
Yeah, I think, we could have. It was funny when Alistair and I were setting this podcast out and planning it out. We said we could actually do an entire podcast on any one of these topics, really deep dive on it and see where things go. So if that would sound interesting to you, why don't you reach out to us and let us know that you'd like to hear a podcast specifically on, the 7 approaches, or, cloud native builds, or I don't think we could do one on marketplaces, but we might be able to find somebody that we could bring on to talk about marketplaces. But Yeah, reach out to us and let us know if you'd like us to do a deep dive on one of these. This is about as deep as we had planned to go for the Technology Whisperers, but we'd be willing to go a little bit deeper if it made sense that the people listening to it wanted us to.
Yeah. And on that similar topic, we really have enjoyed your feedback, enjoyed reading your emails and so forth. And we thank you again for your continued support of the podcast. So it's really been great to hear from all of you. So if you do want to get in touch with either Sean or myself, Sean, what's the best way that people can get in touch with you?
Oh, it's probably through LinkedIn, but I can be found on the Instagrams and the Facebooks, and either LinkedIn or direct email to my sean.muller@servian.com email address.
Yeah. So you're Sean G. Muller on all the social media stuff, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
Excellent. Yeah, and you can get me as well on email at Servian. So it's Alistair, Alistair .Ross @servian.com. You can get me on LinkedIn, just search for Alistair Ross in Servian. And of course, I'm on YouTube and various other things. Search for Al's Geek Lab. That's my own little sort of funny thing where I do.
Channel. It's
Oh,
a brilliant
goodness.
channel. If you haven't had a chance to go look at Alistair's Technology Lab YouTube videos, they're brilliant.
If you're verging on the slightly geeky side and you've got lots of spare time, then absolutely check it out. And if you like anything to do with sort of vintage or retro computing, then it's almost definitely up your street. But that's again a different topic entirely. And of course, outside of the points that we've discussed on the podcast today, and whether we want another deep dive, if there is other topics that you think that you would like to hear discussed on the podcast with Sean and I, please let us also know. And also, if you would like to be a guest on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you as well. We've had quite a few guests now, and they've all been awesome. And so, yeah, please don't be shy about coming up and saying hi. We'd love to hear from you. Yeah. Everybody's got some great points that we could have.
Well, and so we have some additional guests coming up, but Alistair, I'm going to throw something out here, and I didn't cover this off with you ahead of time, but if you listen to our podcast and this doesn't go for people that work at Servian, if you listen to our podcast and you meet us at a conference or something and come up to us and tell us, hey, we listen to Technology Whisperer, either to Alistair or myself, we'll buy you a drink.
I can't say fairer than that. Hey, we might even give you some official Servian swag as well. No promises. But if you see the two bald amigos, you can't miss us. You know what we look like, Yep. Then of course you get in touch and we'll definitely buy you a beer or your favorite non-alcoholic drink if that's what you do. And the last thing I would say is from a housekeeping perspective, Sean, I will not be here next time because I will be in the UK on a little trip. I'll be back. Yeah. I think sort of mid-August. So number 13. Lucky 13 will be without me, so I'm sure it will be awesome. It will be way better.
I have a couple topics. I'll try not to go too deep technical with them. I'm hoping to bring in a guest for one of those podcasts. But yeah, so stick around. Check us out next time. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Speak to you soon. Cheers.